Valentia Photography Workshops video, the exposure triangle, part 1, apertures and shutter speeds. Hi, welcome to another video tutorial from me, Stephen Power, in Valentia Photography Workshops. Today I want to talk about the exposure triangle. A lot of people find this a bit puzzling, confusing, but it's really quite a simple diagrammatic way of showing how the three main settings that control the exposure in a photograph work together: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Now, I would really like to call this the correct exposure triangle because it's all about getting a balance between these three settings so that the photograph is correctly exposed. And by correctly exposed, I mean that there's a good range of tones from dark to light and the mid-tones in the photograph, and that the image is not too dark or too bright. When trying to make sense of how these work together, it's useful to think of them changing in f-stops. And a full f-stop change is half or double the amount that it was previously. That might take a while for you to think about it, but once you get used to that, it makes a lot of sense. So one full stop, one f-stop change, is double or half the previous amount. And you can also change f-stops in thirds, and most cameras will go up in third increments, 3 clicks of the dial of either the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO for one full stop change. And some cameras can be set in half stops. Now, I'm going to look at each of these in turn and talk about how changing one affects the other. Okay, so let's start with the aperture. This is the hole in the lens that lets the light through, and the wider that gets, the less time that light needs to stay on the sensor or the film. So basically, widening or closing the aperture will determine how fast the shutter speed needs to be to give a correct exposure. So if we let's start in the middle here. f8 is a middle aperture. And one full stop change from f8 down, closing the aperture, to f11 means now that we're letting in half as much light as we were previously at f8. So if, for argument's sake, the shutter speed at f8 needed to be 125th of a second to give a correct exposure, then at f11, because there's only half as much light coming through, we need to leave that light on the sensor twice as long. So although it doesn't look exactly right here, this is correct, that 125th of a second doubled, certainly in photography speak, is a 60th of a second. Now, if we were to close the aperture down again, a one stop change from f11 is f16. So now there's 4 times less light coming in. But the aperture is 4 times smaller, so the shutter speed now needs to be 4 times slower. So the shutter speed to give a correct exposure at f16 now, assuming that it was correct at f8, now has to be a 30th of a second. So you've basically got 2 f-stop changes with the aperture f8, f11, 16, and you've got 2 f-stop changes with the shutter speed 125th, 60th and a 30th. So half as much light again, 4 times less light, 4 times slower. So if we think about going the other way now with the aperture, opening it up. So if we start at f8 and open the aperture up 1 full stop to f5.6, we're letting in twice as much light. So in this case, the shutter speed needs to be faster because that amount of light, which is now doubled, needs to be on the sensor for less time, for half as much time. Twice as much light, half as much time. And in this case then, we'll go up to 250th of a second from f8 to 5.6, shutter speed goes up to 250th. If we went up to f4, we're now letting in 4 times as much light from f8, f5, 6, f4, and so the shutter speed now needs to be 4 times faster than where it was at 125th, and that's 500th of a second. And the final one we've got here, opening up again to f2.8, 1 stop up again, wider from f4, now means that the shutter speed is 1,000th of a second, assuming that it was correct at 125th at f8. So you can see, I hope, that if you close the aperture down by 1 stop, you have to make the shutter speed slower by 1 stop, because there is half the amount of light coming in, and so the shutter speed needs to be twice as fast to let that light stay on the sensor for double the amount of time in order to balance the exposure. And similarly, going wider with the aperture, letting in double the amount of light here from 1 stop to another, means that the shutter speed now needs to be faster because it only needs to stay on the sensor half of the time. This can be a fairly complex topic if you're not used to it, so I would suggest going over the video more than once, and it will eventually be very useful to you. In part 2, I'm going to look at how the ISO affects the shutter speed and the aperture at the same time. So please click the subscribe button if you'd like to stay in touch and to get more videos from Valentia Photography Workshops.